The mansion stood at the top of the hill like a fortress, its white stone walls gleaming under the afternoon sun. Inside, silence filled every hallway, broken only by the faint hum of machines in the master bedroom. Eleanor Fairchild, once known as the brightest light of Westfield's elite, now lay confined to a chair that had become both her prison and her constant companion. For 15 long years, her legs had refused to carry her. Doctors had declared her case hopeless, therapists had long since abandoned her, and friends had drifted away as pity turned into avoidance. Her wealth had bought her everything except the one thing she wanted most: freedom. The grand gardens outside bloomed with imported flowers, fountains sparkled in the sunlight, and staff moved quietly through the grounds. Yet Eleanor herself had not set foot beyond her terrace in more than a decade. She watched life from a distance as if the world had gone on without her. Her staff respected her, but they also pitied her. Meals were served on time, rooms were dusted, windows polished, but no one dared look too long into her eyes. The once vibrant woman who had commanded rooms with her wit and laughter was now treated like a fragile ornament. That day, however, something new entered her routine. A new gardener had been hired, a tall black man named Samuel. He arrived quietly with little fanfare, carrying tools worn from years of work rather than shiny and new. Unlike the others, he didn't avoid her gaze when she first saw him from the balcony. Instead, he met her eyes with a calm nod, as if acknowledging not just her wealth or her condition, but her humanity. Eleanor frowned at first. Most people who came to her estate treated her either with exaggerated kindness or cold detachment. But there was something different about him. His movements in the garden were unhurried yet purposeful. He trimmed roses with patience, cleared paths with care, and even paused to speak softly to the plants as if they were listening. That evening, Eleanor asked her housekeeper who the man was. "That's Samuel, ma'am," the woman replied. "He comes highly recommended. They say he's quiet but dependable." "Quiet," Eleanor repeated softly. For her, quiet often meant invisible. But Samuel didn't seem invisible. From her chair near the terrace doors, she found her eyes drawn to him more than once. Something about the way he carried himself unsettled her. It wasn't pity. It wasn't fear. It was dignity. Later that night, as the estate settled into silence, Eleanor thought of him again. She told herself it was nothing, just curiosity about a new face. Yet deep down, she felt an unfamiliar stirring, as if the long-dead embers of her spirit had been touched by the faintest spark. She had no way of knowing then that this quiet gardener, the man society overlooked, the one her wealthy friends would never even notice, was about to change her life in ways she could not yet imagine. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the terrace, and Eleanor sat as she always did, a shawl over her shoulders, a book unopened on her lap. Routine had dulled her days into a blur of sameness, but that morning her attention drifted to the garden below. Samuel was already there. He moved with an ease that was almost rhythmic, pruning branches, brushing soil from his hands, and pausing every so often to tilt his face toward the sky, as though even the sun itself were his companion. Eleanor found herself watching more closely than she meant to. Unlike the other staff, Samuel didn't rush through his work. He wasn't desperate to please, nor afraid to make mistakes. He simply worked with quiet certainty, and that oddly unsettled her. It was as though he belonged here in ways others never did. By mid-morning she called her housekeeper. "Tell the gardener I want fresh flowers brought to the terrace. Roses, preferably." When Samuel appeared carrying a vase of deep red blooms, Eleanor studied him carefully. His hands were strong, calloused, yet they handled the delicate stems with surprising gentleness. He placed the vase on the table beside her without a word. "Thank you," she said, her voice measured. He gave a small nod. "You're welcome, ma'am." She expected him to leave, but he lingered for just a moment, his eyes meeting hers. They weren't the eyes of a servant awaiting orders, they were the eyes of a man who had lived, endured, and refused to bow. Then, without another word, he returned to his work. That night, Eleanor thought about that look. It bothered her in ways she couldn't explain. She had grown used to being seen through one of two lenses, either as the fragile invalid or as the wealthy patron who signed paychecks. Samuel saw neither. He looked at her as though she were simply human. It unsettled her precisely because it felt unfamiliar. In the days that followed, Eleanor found excuses to call for him. A plant needed repotting. The fountain seemed to have lost some of its sparkle. The hedges, though already trimmed, could perhaps be neater. Each time Samuel appeared, did his work calmly and left. He never lingered, never groveled, never asked questions. Yet each brief encounter left her thinking about him long after he was gone. One afternoon, as he adjusted a potted fern near the terrace, Eleanor surprised herself by speaking more than usual. "How long have you been a gardener?" she asked. Samuel paused, wiped his hands on his trousers, and looked at her with quiet honesty. "All my life in some way. I worked with my father when I was young. Plants don't judge you. They don't care where you're from. You give them care and they give back. Simple as that." Eleanor felt something catch in her throat. She couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken so plainly in her presence. No flattery, no guarded words, just truth. When he left, she sat staring at the fern, wondering why her heart felt oddly lighter. For the first time in years, her days no longer felt like endless repetitions of loneliness. There was a shift in the air, small, almost imperceptible, but real. And though Eleanor didn't want to admit it, she found herself waiting each morning to see Samuel's dark figure moving among the roses, as if his presence was pulling her back toward a life she thought she had lost forever. Days passed, and Eleanor's curiosity about Samuel grew stronger than she cared to admit. She began rising earlier, positioning herself by the window so she could catch the moment he stepped into the garden. His movements were steady, deliberate, never rushed, as though every task had meaning. She found herself timing her meals, her reading, even her rest around the rhythm of his work outside. At first she told herself it was simple distraction. After all, what else did she have? Her world had been reduced to 4 walls, her wheelchair, and memories of what once was. Watching Samuel was just a way to pass the hours. At least that was the excuse she repeated. But deep down she knew there was more. One afternoon, she asked the maid to wheel her out onto the terrace instead of leaving her by the window. The spring air was warm, filled with the scent of lavender and roses. She hadn't felt sunlight on her face for longer than a few minutes in years. Samuel was working near the fountain, his hands wet as he adjusted the stones and let the water cascade evenly again. When he noticed her on the terrace, he paused, straightened his back, and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't the deferential bow of a servant, it was a greeting between equals. Eleanor surprised herself by calling out, "Mr. Samuel, tell me, why do you talk to the plants?" He glanced at the rose bushes and then back at her. "Because everything living listens," he said simply. "And because they can't speak back, people assume they don't matter. But they do. Just like people others overlook." The words struck her harder than she expected. She had been overlooked for years, reduced to a symbol of tragedy rather than a person. Hearing him put voice to that truth unsettled her deeply. For the first time in many years, Eleanor laughed softly, though there was a tremor in it. "Then I suppose I'm not so different from those plants." Samuel looked at her with quiet steadiness. "The difference, ma'am, is that plants don't forget how to grow. Sometimes people do." The remark lingered in her mind long after he walked away. No one had spoken to her like that in years, not with pity, not with flattery, but with gentle challenge. It was as though he refused to let her define herself only by her wheelchair. That evening, as the mansion grew quiet, Eleanor wheeled herself to her mirror. She stared at the woman reflected back, pale skin, sharp cheekbones, eyes dimmed by years of disappointment. She whispered to herself, almost like a confession, "Have I forgotten how to grow?" For the first time in a long while, she didn't have an answer. The next day, she asked her maid to bring her outside again. Samuel was pruning near the hedge when she spoke. "Do you believe people like me, people broken, can change?" He didn't hesitate. "You're not broken. You're waiting. There's a difference. Broken means the end. Waiting means there's more ahead." She stared at him, stunned by the certainty in his voice. No doctor, no friend, no priest had ever spoken to her like that. They all offered sympathy or clinical explanations. Samuel offered belief. And in that moment, Eleanor realized something had shifted. She was no longer watching him out of idle curiosity. She was listening. She was remembering. The quiet gardener she had once dismissed as just another employee was awakening something she thought had died within her long ago. The following week brought long stretches of sunlight, and Eleanor found herself outside more often than she had in years. Each time Samuel passed the terrace, she felt a strange pull to speak to him. It wasn't conversation for the sake of politeness, it was because his words left echoes inside her that refused to fade. On a warm afternoon, he was kneeling by the flower beds, his hands deep in the soil. Eleanor studied him for a long moment before asking, "Samuel, do you ever grow tired of working in other people's gardens? Creating beauty you can never truly call your own?" He paused, brushing the dirt from his palms, and turned toward her with a thoughtful expression. "No, ma'am. Because when something grows, it doesn't ask who owns the land. It just blooms. That's enough for me. And besides, helping something grow is a kind of ownership too. You carry it in here." He tapped his chest lightly. Eleanor didn't answer right away. His words cut deeper than she expected. For years she had measured ownership in money, in deeds, in signatures. But she had never thought of it as nurturing, as carrying growth within yourself. The next day, Samuel appeared earlier than usual. He was carrying a small clay pot with a single young plant sprouting inside. He set it gently on the table beside Eleanor's chair. "What is this?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. "A jasmine plant," he replied. "It'll need care every day. Water, sunlight, patience. I thought maybe you'd like to try." Eleanor gave a short laugh, though it trembled at the edges. "Do you think I'm capable of keeping something alive? I can barely take care of myself." Samuel met her gaze calmly. "That's not true. You've been surviving for 15 years. That takes more strength than most people know. This," he nodded at the little plant, "this is just the next step." She looked down at the fragile sprout, its tiny green leaves stretching toward the sun. Something inside her stirred, a strange mixture of fear and determination. For the first time in years she wanted to try. The following morning, Eleanor asked her maid to wheel her outside before breakfast. The plant waited on the table, thirsty in the rising heat. With trembling hands, she lifted the watering can Samuel had left nearby and poured carefully until the soil darkened. The motion was simple, almost insignificant. Yet to her, it felt monumental, like reclaiming a part of herself she thought was lost forever. When Samuel noticed, he smiled, not the wide grin of someone seeking praise, but a quiet acknowledgement, a recognition of effort. Over the next week, Eleanor watered the jasmine every morning. She found herself watching the leaves for subtle changes, waiting for signs of growth. The act became a ritual, and with it, a sense of purpose began to return. One afternoon, as she carefully adjusted the pot's position to catch the light, Samuel stepped closer. "You see? Growth doesn't happen all at once. It takes time, care, and trust. But it happens." Eleanor nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the small plant. For the first time in many years, she whispered words not to herself, but to something that might one day depend on her. "Keep growing." That night, she lay awake long after the house had gone still. For years she had accepted her life as finished, her body as useless. Yet now, because of a simple plant and the words of a quiet gardener, she found herself wondering, was she really finished, or was she simply waiting as Samuel had said? And in that question, a seed of hope began to take root. The jasmine had begun to show signs of life. Its tiny leaves stretched higher, its stem stronger than before. Eleanor checked it each morning, and each day it gave her something she hadn't felt in years, a reason to look forward. She had grown accustomed to failure, to disappointment, to the finality of doctors' voices telling her nothing could be done. Yet here was proof that fragile things could endure, even flourish, with patience and care. Samuel noticed the change in her eyes before she did. He began speaking more when he worked near her, never forcing conversation, but offering words that lingered. One afternoon, as he trimmed back the roses, he said, "It's easy to mistake stillness for weakness. But sometimes stillness is just waiting for the right season to move again." Eleanor looked at him sharply, sensing the double meaning. You're speaking of me, aren't you? He paused, then answered evenly. If the shoe fits, ma'am. She gave a laugh, short, dry, but real. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had dared speak to her so plainly. There was something disarming about Samuel. He didn't treat her like a porcelain doll, nor like an employer to impress. He spoke to her as if she were simply a person. That evening she replayed his words in her mind. Waiting for the right season. Could it be true that she had been waiting all these years rather than finished? The thought frightened her almost as much as it stirred her. A few days later, Samuel approached her terrace carrying a wooden cane. He set it against the railing. Eleanor frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing yet, he said calmly. But sometimes it helps to see what could be possible even before you believe it yourself. Her chest tightened. She turned her face away, the old anger rising in her throat. You don't understand. You think I haven't tried? 15 years, Samuel. 15 years of pain, humiliation, disappointment. I've been told again and again that there's nothing left for me. Nothing. He didn't flinch at her outburst. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice low but steady. You're alive. That means there's always something left. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Eleanor gripped the arms of her chair, her breathing uneven. She wanted to shout at him, to send him away, but instead she found herself trembling, not with rage but with something she hadn't felt in years, defiance. The next morning when she saw the cane still leaning by the railing, she didn't order it removed. Instead, she sat staring at it for a long time, her thoughts tangled between dread and longing. By late afternoon she couldn't resist. Her hand, frail but determined, reached out and brushed against the smooth wood. Her pulse quickened at the simple touch. She imagined standing, imagined moving forward, and the idea was so terrifying that she snatched her hand back as though the cane had burned her. Yet the image remained. That night, when she closed her eyes, she didn't dream of the stillness of her chair. She dreamed of standing, wobbly, uncertain, but standing. For the first time in years, Eleanor's prison no longer felt absolute. And it was Samuel, with his quiet persistence and unwavering dignity, who had cracked the walls she thought unbreakable. The cane remained on the terrace for days. Eleanor told herself she hated it, that it mocked her every time her eyes fell on it. Yet she never asked the staff to take it away. Instead, she found herself glancing at it whenever Samuel worked nearby, half expecting him to say something, half dreading that he would. But Samuel never pushed. He let the cane sit in silence, waiting, like a seed planted in her mind. One morning, while the air was crisp and filled with the song of sparrows, Samuel wheeled a small wooden chair onto the terrace and placed it across from her. "What are you doing?" Eleanor asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "Giving you company," he replied, sitting down opposite her. He leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "Do you know the strongest thing a plant does?" She frowned. "Grow." "No," he said softly. "It reaches. Always. Even when the soil is poor, even when rocks block its way, it stretches toward the light. That reaching is strength." Eleanor looked down at her hands, her thin fingers folded in her lap. "And what if you reach and fall?" "Then you reach again," he answered without hesitation. "Falling isn't failure. Staying down is." The simplicity of his words stirred something in her chest that she wanted to deny but couldn't. For years her life had been ruled by fear of falling. Physically, emotionally, socially. Samuel made falling sound less like an ending and more like a step. That afternoon, when the staff had gone about their duties and the house was quiet, Samuel stood beside her chair. He spoke gently, his tone firm but kind. "Eleanor, I want you to try something. Not tomorrow. Not later. Now." Her heart raced. "You're mad. I told you I can't." "You don't have to walk," he interrupted. "Not yet. Just try to stand. I'll be here. You won't fall." The words struck her like thunder. No doctor had dared speak them in years. No one had challenged her to try. They had all declared her case impossible, urging her only toward acceptance. Her mouth went dry, her body stiff with fear. She gripped the arms of her wheelchair as if letting go would mean death itself. "I can't," she whispered, her throat tight. "You can," Samuel said quietly. Maybe only for a moment, maybe only halfway. But you can. The air seemed to freeze. Eleanor closed her eyes, tears pressing at the corners. Her whole body trembled as she slowly, painfully, placed her hands on the cane. The wood was cool beneath her palms, steady, unyielding. With Samuel's hand hovering close, ready to catch her but never forcing, she pushed against the arms of the chair. Her body screamed in protest, her legs heavy as stone. Sweat beaded on her forehead. For one terrifying instant she thought she would collapse. Then, unbelievably, she felt it, her knees locking, her body rising. Not fully, not gracefully, but enough. For the first time in 15 years, Eleanor Fairchild was not sitting. She was standing. Her breath came ragged, tears streaming down her cheeks. I can't believe it, she whispered. Samuel's steady voice cut through her trembling. Believe it? Because it's happening. Her legs wobbled and she sank back into the chair, collapsing with both exhaustion and exhilaration. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing, not from pain, but from something she had almost forgotten existed. Oh. Samuel crouched beside her, his tone calm, unwavering. This is just the beginning. Don't let fear tell you otherwise. You're stronger than you know. For the rest of the evening, Eleanor couldn't stop replaying that single moment in her mind, the moment when gravity no longer owned her, when the impossible had bent to her will. For the first time in 15 years she knew that her prison had cracks. And through those cracks light was beginning to pour in. The night after her first attempt, Eleanor barely slept. Each time she closed her eyes she saw herself rising, knees trembling, the world tilting around her. She relived the terror of almost falling, yet alongside it was something new, the overwhelming rush of standing, however briefly. For 15 years she had been told it was impossible, and yet, against every prediction, she had done it. The next morning she lingered by the terrace doors, staring at the cane still leaning against the railing. Her maid entered, carrying breakfast. "Shall I wheel you out, ma'am?" Eleanor hesitated. "Not yet," she murmured. When the maid left, she reached for the cane on her own. Her hands shook as she grasped it, her breath uneven. She glanced around the empty room, making sure no one was watching, and then pressed her palms firmly on the arms of her chair. It took every ounce of will, but slowly, painfully she rose again. Her body wobbled, her legs weak, but she was standing. Alone. Without Samuel's watchful eyes. Tears stung her as she clutched the cane for balance. For a few seconds she felt taller than the walls around her, taller than the life that had caged her. Then, exhausted, she sank back into the chair, her chest heaving with both pride and fear. When Samuel arrived later, she didn't mention what she had done. He worked quietly in the garden, his back turned, humming softly to himself. Eleanor wanted to call out, to tell him she had managed on her own, but pride held her back. She wasn't ready to share the fragile miracle she had discovered in secret. Over the following days she repeated the attempt. Sometimes she managed to stand for several seconds, her grip tight on the cane. Other times her strength faltered quickly, leaving her shaken and drained. Yet she kept trying. Each effort chipped away at the walls of fear that had ruled her life for so long. Still, doubt clung to her. One afternoon, Samuel noticed the fatigue in her face as she watched him from the terrace. "You're restless," he said, setting down his tools. Eleanor stiffened. Restless? Or foolish? What if all of this is just a cruel trick? A moment of strength before everything collapses again? Samuel met her gaze steadily. What if it isn't? What if it's the start of something you've been waiting for all along? Her lips trembled. You don't understand what it feels like to be broken for so long. To want something so desperately and be told it's gone forever. His expression softened, though his voice carried quiet conviction. You think I don't understand struggle? Eleanor, the world has told me all my life what I could and couldn't be. I've heard voices that said I didn't belong, that my place was beneath others. If I had believed them, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be standing. The truth is, no one decides your limits but you. His words cut deep. For the first time, she realized Samuel wasn't just teaching her about strength, he was showing her his own. He carried a history she didn't know, battles she couldn't see, but his dignity spoke of victories won in silence. That evening, when the household settled into quiet, Eleanor tried again. This time she stood a little longer. The trembling was still there, but so was determination. She whispered into the dim room, not caring if anyone heard, "I will not stay down. Not anymore." For the first time in 15 years, Eleanor felt as though she was reclaiming pieces of herself, pieces she thought were buried forever. And with each attempt, the distance between who she had become and who she once was began to shrink. The days that followed seemed different, as though the rhythm of Eleanor's life had shifted. The mansion was still vast and quiet, the staff still moved about in practiced silence, but to her the air itself felt charged. She had crossed a line she thought forever closed. She had stood. And that knowledge, fragile as it was, gave her something she hadn't carried in years: anticipation. Each morning, Samuel appeared in the garden, and Eleanor found herself watching him with sharper eyes. She no longer saw just the gardener trimming roses or carrying soil. She saw the man who had given her the courage to face herself. Their conversations grew longer, slipping past casual words into something deeper. He didn't flatter her nor pity her. Instead, he asked questions about her past, her thoughts, her fears, forcing her to confront the parts of herself she had buried away. One afternoon, after she had watered the jasmine with steady hands, Samuel came to her side. He placed the cane near her chair as he always did, but this time he added something new: a steady, open hand. "Eleanor," he said softly, "you've proven to yourself you can stand. Now I want you to try something more. Just one step. That's all." Her stomach tightened. The word step felt enormous, impossible. One step. "Samuel, I haven't walked in 15 years. Do you understand what you're asking?" "I do," he replied calmly. "And I also know you're stronger than the fear keeping you down. Just one step. I'll be here the whole time." Her heart hammered as she placed her hands on the arms of the chair. The cane steadied her, and Samuel's presence gave her strength she didn't know she had. Slowly, painfully she rose, her legs quivering beneath her. The terrace seemed vast, every stone tile stretching endlessly ahead of her. Samuel's hand hovered close, not touching but ready. "One step," he reminded her gently. Eleanor took a sharp breath and shifted her weight. Her right foot dragged forward, shaky, uncertain, but it moved. For a moment, she balanced between collapse and triumph. Then her foot landed against the stone with a soft thud. One step. Just one. The rush of emotion overwhelmed her. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but this time they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of victory. She looked up at Samuel, her lips trembling. I did it." His expression was steady, but his eyes shone with quiet pride. "Yes, you did. And tomorrow maybe you'll take another." Exhaustion pulled her back into the chair, but the glow of that moment refused to leave her. She had walked, if only a single step, and the world had not collapsed. Instead, it had opened wider than she remembered. That evening, as the household drifted into silence, Eleanor whispered to herself, "One step becomes two. Two becomes more." She no longer felt like a prisoner of her chair. She felt like someone standing at the edge of a new beginning, trembling but unbroken. And Samuel, the man the world would have ignored, was the one walking with her into that unknown. The days blended into one another, yet for Eleanor each carried a small triumph. She began to rise from her chair daily, sometimes taking one step, sometimes two, her hands gripping the cane while Samuel's steady presence gave her courage. The strain left her breathless, her legs trembling as though they might betray her at any moment, but she pressed on. What once felt impossible was now a fragile routine. Fragile but alive. Her maid noticed first. Carrying a tray of tea to the terrace one afternoon, she paused at the doorway, stunned to see Eleanor upright, Samuel nearby, his hand hovering close but never holding her. Eleanor froze when she realized she had been seen, her face flushing with both pride and embarrassment. "Ma'am," the maid whispered, her eyes wide, "You're standing?" Eleanor sank quickly back into her chair, her voice tight. "It's nothing. Go on with your work." But it wasn't nothing, and soon the whispers began to circle the household. The cook mentioned it in the kitchen, the butler shook his head in disbelief, and the younger maids shared rumors behind closed doors. To them, the image of their mistress, once resigned to a chair for 15 years, rising on her own legs was unthinkable. Some doubted it outright. Others whispered that perhaps Samuel had done something unusual, something unnatural. When word finally reached the housekeeper, she approached Eleanor carefully, her tone both respectful and uneasy. "Madam, I hear you've been attempting to stand again. Is it wise? You could hurt yourself." Eleanor's eyes flashed with a spark that hadn't been seen in years. "Do not mistake fear for wisdom," she said firmly. "If pain comes, so be it. I've lived with worse." The housekeeper lowered her eyes, murmuring, "Yes, madam," but the doubt lingered in the air. That evening, Samuel found Eleanor restless. She wheeled herself back and forth along the terrace, her lips tight, her eyes distant. "They're talking," she admitted bitterly when he asked. "The staff think I'm foolish. That this is nothing more than a passing delusion. Some even whisper you've put strange ideas in my head." Samuel leaned against the railing, calm as ever. "Let them talk. People fear what challenges what they've accepted. For years, everyone accepted you as broken. Now you're proving them wrong. That unsettles them more than your chair ever did." Eleanor stared at him, her anger slowly softening into reflection. And what if they're right? What if this is just a cruel tease, a fleeting burst before everything fails again? He stepped closer, his voice steady. "Then you fall and you rise again. Growth isn't a straight line, Eleanor. It never is. What matters isn't what they believe, it's what you do, every day despite the fear." His words sank deep, and for the first time, Eleanor realized she no longer cared about the whispers as much as she thought. What mattered was the fire that had returned to her spirit, a flame Samuel had helped ignite. That night, long after the mansion had gone quiet, she stood alone in her room. Her legs quivered, her grip on the cane tight, but she took one step, then another, across the thick carpet. When she collapsed back into her chair, tears streamed freely, but they were tears of triumph. No one else needed to see it. For the first time in years, Eleanor knew the truth. Her strength was real. And soon the world beyond her terrace would know it too. And the mansion grew louder with each passing day. Some dismissed them as fantasy, others clung to them as hope. But no one expected what would happen next. Eleanor herself had reached a breaking point, not of despair but of resolve. For 15 years she had been defined by her chair, her illness, and the shadow of defeat. Now, with Samuel at her side, she was ready to tear away that definition once and for all. The morning was bright, sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the drawing room. The staff had gathered there for their daily instructions when Eleanor entered, wheeled in by her maid. The room went silent, every eye on her. In years past they had looked upon her with pity. Today her expression carried something new, determination. "Samuel," she said calmly, her voice carrying through the hush, "bring me the cane." Gasps rippled through the room. The butler frowned, the housekeeper pressed her lips together, and several of the younger maids exchanged anxious glances. Samuel, however, stepped forward without hesitation. He placed the cane gently in her hands and stood back, his face steady, his presence solid as stone. Eleanor took a long breath. The weight of 15 years pressed against her, the doubts of doctors, the whispers of servants, the echo of her own voice telling her it was impossible. Her palms dampened, her knees trembled before she had even risen. Then, with every ounce of will she possessed, she pushed. The room froze as she lifted herself, slowly, painfully, but with a power that no one could deny. Her legs shook, her grip tight on the cane, but she stood, upright, tall, alive. For the first time in years, she looked down on the room not from her chair, but from her own height. The silence broke into a collective gasp. One maid dropped a tray, the butler's jaw fell open, and the housekeeper whispered a prayer under her breath. Eleanor, breathless but unyielding, steadied herself and spoke in a clear, trembling voice. "This is not the end of me. Not anymore." Then, with Samuel's quiet encouragement, she shifted her weight and took a step. The cane clicked against the marble floor, the sound sharp and undeniable. She took another, her body wavering, but each movement filled the room with awe. By the third step, Tears glistened in the eyes of those who had once doubted her. When at last her strength gave way, Samuel was there, guiding her gently back into the chair. But the room had already changed. The staff no longer saw a frail woman confined to a chair. They saw Eleanor Fairchild, the woman who had defied every expectation, who had risen against all odds. As the household buzzed with disbelief and wonder, Eleanor turned to Samuel. Her eyes, bright with tears, held gratitude and something more, unshakable resolve. "You were right," she whispered. "I was never broken. I was only waiting." Samuel's expression softened into the smallest of smiles. "And now you've begun again." That night, Eleanor looked out at the garden under the moonlight. The jasmine plant on her terrace had bloomed, its delicate white flowers reaching toward the stars. She touched one gently, her heart swelling with recognition. She had thought herself finished, but she was only just beginning. The woman who had been imprisoned by stillness for 15 years was gone. In her place stood someone reborn, fragile yet fierce, trembling yet unstoppable. And though the world would remember Samuel as the gardener, Eleanor knew the truth. He was the man who had given her back her life, not by magic, not by miracle, but by reminding her of the strength she had carried all along. Her story was no longer one of loss. It was one of rising.